Hi everyone. Welcome back into Matt Sports Talk, and this is our final episode. This is hard to believe, the absolute final episode of season 2 of Matt Sports Talk, and I can't wait for the summer break, and it is just absolutely going to be amazing. That is for sure. And as we end this video, we are going to talk about the women's side of things, which I cannot wait to dive into in terms of just recapping the women's side of things this year. And it was a really good year. It really, really was on the women's side. And I am going to talk more about these teams. So we're going to start bottom to top. And of course, I'm not going to go in order of each individual team, because, obviously I want to talk about Indiana Wesleyan last, because that is a team that I really think that they could easily turn their season around. Of course, they had a year this year they have not been known to have, but I really think the sky's the limit for them next year. So super excited to talk more about them coming up here in just a little bit. So starting first with Goshen, obviously they had a down year, and they only won, I believe, one. No, I don't think they won a conference game this year. Again, I don't have my iPad in front of me where I could double check that, but they still, despite that, they still won a good amount of games in non-conference play. Of course, you had so many players for them. Kyla Foster in her 5th year, out of McKinley High School in Canton, Ohio. She played great this year, had several games where she had a double-double, which is just absolutely amazing in terms of only being, I believe, 5'6". And there were some games, I believe both games against Mount Vernon, she had, I believe, 16, 17 rebounds, which is just absolutely amazing to think about, especially when, when you're only 5'6", and you don't really expect somebody to have, those amount of rebounds. And for them, she played really well this year. Carrie Heiler off the bench was a really, really big spark for this Lady Maple Leaf team. Of course, you also had Lillian Null as well, played really good. So this is a Lady Maple Leaf team that I think could really improve next year, and I know they'll continue to improve. And obviously for them, trying to get some more size down low, that's going to be a huge emphasis for them. So we'll see how that plays out. And of course, your team that just missed out on the Crossroads League tournament was Mount Vernon Nazarene. This was a team who went 4-14 in the conference, just missing out on the league tournament. Of course, this was a team that lost a lot of people from last year. Of course, they lost Serenity Johnson, Teresa Maggio, and I believe those I think were the only 2 that I want to say. Of course, there might have been more than that, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But, for this year, of course, you had Angela Roshak, played really good this year, a senior out of North Canton, Ohio, Hoover High School product. Again, Hoover produces a lot of great basketball. That is for sure. Of course, we were up there, I believe it was two years ago, I believe, when we were up there and watched my niece play volleyball. And so, we watched a little bit of Hoover's main varsity team, and man, that is just such a great venue to be in up there, and very tough environment, and it was a lot of fun, that is for sure. And so, and you look at not just Roshak, we also look at this year. Of course, you added some transfers this year from, head coach Lauren Van Hoos came from Ohio Christian and brought Lily Shepard along with her, and Shepard is going to be graduating here in about a month, and she ended up being one of the Lady Cougars' leading scorers this year, averaged 12 points a game, and played really, really well. And of course, down low, you also had Anna Swisshelm, Saltmore, redshirt, and she played excellent. And of course, against Indiana Wesleyan here in Mount Vernon, she scored, I believe, 19 points in that game, and scored, I believe, 17 or 18 in the game at Indiana Wesleyan back in February. So again, super, super excited for what this Lady Cougar team out of Mount Vernon is going to do next year. I think they're going to be a lot better next year. Of course, they're adding in some really, really good players, so I'm excited to see where next season takes them. And then, of course, 8th place, Grace College Lancers. Again, another team that I think, and I know they set the all-time scoring record, not just in NAIA, but also NCAA Division I, regardless of level. 190, I think it was 172 points against Ohio Christian. So again, and this was a Lady Lancer team that started off 5-0 in the season for the second straight year, and then obviously injuries just really hurt them down the stretch. However, they had some really good scoring. Emma Sperry, Morgan Houck, Maddie Pointer, all averaging 17 points per game or higher, which is just absolutely amazing. Sperry averaged, I believe, 21 points per game. And this is a Lady Lancer team that, if they can keep everybody fully healthy moving forward, they are going to be a very, very tough team to beat next year. And this is a team that I definitely will be watching. I think they'll be a lot better than 8th next year. I'm not making my official predictions quite yet, but they had a really good year outside of that. And I know that the record doesn't indicate that, but they are they're way more talented than being an 8 seed in the Crossroads League. And what a year they had, despite the record not really indicating that. But talent-wise, they played really, really well. That is for sure. So, and that's my thoughts about them. And then, of course, for Taylor Trojans, they finished 7th, exactly where I had them projected. This is a team under head coach Cassie Wiseman that nobody really talked about. And they started off I believe it was 14-0, and then they got into conference play, and that pretty much ended that. People started to figure them out a lot better. And despite that, I mean, you had obviously Casey Warfel, really no surprise. She averaged 25 points per game this year, and of course Selena Blount set the Taylor school record for most blocks in a single season. So big congratulations to them. Casey Warfel was named Crossroads League Freshman Player of the Year. Again, not really surprised at that. And this is a Trojan team, of course, and then, of course, when Blount did not play that much, you had some other players that really stepped up big. Marissa Trout, Emma Anselet, as well as Maddie Allen. All those girls played really, really well and this year, and I definitely think that these Taylor Lady Trojans are going to be a lot better this upcoming year, and I'm super, super excited to see where next year takes them. Let me adjust my camera real quick, because it looked like my camera lens was falling down just a little bit. Let me adjust my headroom. That should work. So that is my view of Taylor. And then, of course, outside of them, you also have, in 6th place officially, you had the Bethel Lady Pilots out of Mishawaka, Indiana, and this is a team that had a really good year, and they were 1-3 at one point in conference play, and of course everybody had thought, hey, this team's probably going to be down at the very bottom, like they always seem to be, but not this year. And after the 1-3 start, they went 9-5 after that, had some excellent wins this year. And of course, I'm not going to allude to, every single team in terms of their most important key wins this year. But in terms of Bethel, I mean, they had some big upset wins, 2 against Huntington, and 1, actually, if you count the league tournament, 2 against Spring Arbor. So that was a really, really amazing achievement, for head coach Scott Paulsgrove, his assistant Austin Hawkins. And they did such a great job this year. And I'm just so thankful and glad that they were able to have the year that they did. Very well deserved for them. Of course, obviously losing some key seniors, Hannah Ruddle, Jasmine Smith, Mariah Claywell. 2, I mean, Ruddle, she could score a lot of points. She didn't really play that much, though, but specifically Jasmine Smith and Mariah Claywell, these are 2 young ladies that are going to be deeply missed, and they had stellar careers for Lady Pilots, especially this year. The team went 23-12, made it to the NCCAA tournament, and out in Missouri, and ended up losing in the championship game to College of the Ozarks. But despite that, they made the NAIA National Tournament for the first time since 2013, and they lost to 1-seeded Freed Hardman Lady Lions in the second round in Henderson, Tennessee. But despite that, these Bethel Pilots, they're gonna be a team to definitely watch next year. That is for sure. And that is my view of them. And then I'll skip Indiana Wesleyan momentarily. 4th place, officially, you had the Huntington Lady Foresters. And this is a team that made the national tournament back-to-back years. I think I talked about them, I believe it was yesterday or the day before in one of my recap videos, where, of course, I said that, losing star player Bailey Kellum due to an ACL injury, that really hurt them this year. But despite that, I mean, they still had a phenomenal year. They're going to get Kellum back fully healthy this upcoming year. And this is a Lady Forester team that I definitely think is going to be right back in the mix for a top 3 or top 4 spot. And the sky's the limit, especially for them. And again, they had some excellent wins this year. Upset number 4 Marion at Huntington in the regular season. But of course, and they upset Taylor at Taylor. I mean, I guess it wasn't totally an upset, but actually Taylor beat them at Taylor. I stand corrected. But Huntington beat Taylor at Huntington earlier in the season, so a good win for them. And of course, Huntington also upset Indiana Tech in non-conference play. Same thing for Taylor. So again, like Huntington and Taylor, they had some excellent wins this year. Of course, Taylor upset Olivet Nazarene in non-conference play, put up, I believe, 112 points, and Olivet put up, I believe, 91, and it still wasn't enough to win, which that doesn't happen very often. But again, this is a Lady Forester team I think is just going to get better, so that's my view on them in terms of a season recap on them. And then, of course, I mentioned in my men's season recap video my plans for next year. So if you missed any of that information, you can go back and watch that video on my men's season recap video to view that information there. And I hope that's very helpful and informative to you. And then, of course, you have Spring Arbor Lady Cougars, finished third this year, pretty much exactly where they were projected to be. And head coach John Williams and company, he's done a really good job. His assistants Terrence Williams and Alex Scott, they've done a really, really good job as well. And this is a team that in his fifth year, they have made the national tournament every single year, and they made the Sweet 16 round this year, ended up losing to Campbellsville by 10 points. That was the furthest that the Lady Cougars out of Michigan had gone since the 1998/1999 season, and when they reached the Elite Eight way back then. And their wins this year tied the program's record for most wins in a single season. Of course, the previous record was in Coach Williams' second season. So again, this is a Lady Cougar team that they definitely have figured it out. And head coach John Williams, he does such a great job, and he's led the team to be way more aggressive on defense. They actually ranked first in the league this year in forcing turnovers per game. And obviously, I think that has led to their success. And I really think that moving forward, that if they continue to be that aggressive, they are going to keep finishing in the top 3 or 4 in the Crossroads League just because of their aggressive playing style. Which, again, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I know some teams might say, oh, well, we don't like to, be fully trapped in the backcourt, every single time we have the ball. Which, I mean, I totally understand that. But at the same time, if you're Spring Arbor, if you play that aggressively, same thing for Grace. When you play that aggressively, that 9 times out of 10 is going to lead to success. So now again, that's beatable. You look at when Indiana Wesleyan played Spring Arbor. Indiana Wesleyan both times this year did not figure Spring Arbor's defense out until it was too late. So again, but you learn from that, and going into next season when the Lady Wildcats will play the Lady Cougars out of Michigan, I really think that the Lady Wildcats are going to be able to figure out Spring Arbor. I think that they're going to be looking at game film a lot closer, trying to figure out how to beat the backcourt trap. Obviously before time runs out on the game clock. So super excited to see what happens with Spring Arbor this upcoming year. And then of course second place you had St. Francis Cougars out of Fort Wayne, Indiana. They made the Sweet 16 this year, they made the Elite. I'm pretty sure they made the Elite Eight. Because I know, they made the Elite Eight because they beat Hastings in the Sweet 16, went to the Elite Eight, and ended up losing that game to Dordt. And so, you look at St. Francis and this team this year, they're only losing one senior, that's Julia Mantala. And this is a Lady Cougar team led by Callie Gregory, who is a star sophomore player. And I have no doubt that this team is going to be right back in the national tournament next year. Of course, they made the national tournament last year, ended up losing at home in the first round to Indiana Tech. But this year, St. Francis won the first 2 rounds at home, and then went out to Sioux City, Iowa. So again, super excited to see where St. Francis is this year. Of course, their only losses this year. I believe they went 30-5, and now one of their losses was to Marion. Then obviously the other loss was to Dordt in the Elite Eight. And 2 of the losses were to Indiana Wesleyan. So again, that this is going to be a team that I really think is going to have a great year next year as well. So that is my view of them. And then Marion Lady Knights winning the Crossroads League Tournament Championship this year, and the regular season, and the NAIA National Championship for the first time since 2017. So head coach Santana Anderson and her assistant Cedric Riddle, such a great job leading that team this year. And of course, for the McNally sisters, obviously a very and understandably a very emotional time winning the national title this year, 35-3. And honestly, 2019/20, I think the Lady Knights would have won the national title that year had it not been for COVID. But still, to come back this year and win a national championship, that I'm sure means so much to the program, and obviously so well deserved for them. And of course, you look at who they're losing. Obviously, the McNally sisters; those are two big losses in terms of your offense and defense. But also Kenna Kirby, who provided a huge spark off the bench this year and shot beyond good from 3-point range. So obviously, losing those three players is going to be absolutely very, very huge. But outside of that, of course, you're still left with some good leadership with Taylor Double, Madison Bailey. And then, of course, Olivia Faust in her redshirt senior year, coming back for her 5th year of eligibility next year. So she is going to be a huge, huge part of this Lady Knights offense. And I really, really think that this is a team that is going to be a top 2 contender in the Crossroads League next year, because they're just loaded with so much talent. Yeah, and again, like, I know that they won a national title this year. They're riding an 18-game winning streak heading into next year. But I honestly think that this is a Lady Knights team that, again, is going to be very, very dangerous next year. And definitely a team to watch out for. So that is my view of them. And then last but not least, Indiana Wesleyan. Of course, last year they finished the national tournament champion runners-up, falling to Dordt in that tough championship game. This year there were just so many high expectations, did not come to fruition, unfortunately, due to injuries. And, of course, losing pretty near the whole entire starting 5 from last year. But despite that, I know the record doesn't indicate it, 19-14, 10-8 in conference play. However, they went 6-3 in the second half of conference play, picked up some really, really good wins this year, 2 of which coming against number 6 St. Francis, which was huge, beat them by 21 at home, and then upset them at St. Francis by 2 in the second matchup of the regular season. But also some really, really tough losses. You look at, losing to Spring Arbor at home, not a bad loss, but then losing to Grace by 10 points despite scoring 80 on January 10th. That obviously is a bad loss. And then, of course, you look at losing at home to Huntington in double overtime, February 4th. Very, very tough loss, especially because the Lady Wildcats were up 7 points at one point in that game in overtime, couldn't close it out. Very next game, you lose at Spring Arbor in overtime. And then after that, that's really when the momentum shifted. You beat Mount Vernon at home by 21 points, February 11th. You go to Grace, very tough place to play in. You beat them by 6 points, and really it probably should have been more than that because of all the missed free throws. And then obviously losing to Marion at home. I mean, you know what you're getting with Marion. Excellent loss. And really, outside of free throws, you really only lost that game by 6 or 7 points, which again is an excellent loss because of how good Marion is. And then, of course, home, you're home against Bethel on Senior Day. You want to avenge the loss 1 year prior on Senior Day to Marion in overtime without your star player, Lily Frazier, at the time. And then you look at, what the team was able to do this year on Senior Day, pick up a huge overtime win against Bethel. Very, very good team this year. And obviously, you win that game by 7 points. And then you go to Huntington in the first round of the league tournament. You upset them by 9. And really probably should have been by 20 if you make all your free throws, which again, missed free throws, that's the name of the game. You're not going to make all your free throws, and obviously you want to improve on that, going into next year. But, and then of course you go to Marion, you lose by, 40, 45, 47 points, I think it was, with the largest margin of victory in the all-time series history for the Lady Knights. And then, of course, the Wildcats, after that game, you're like, okay, well, do we have a chance of making the national tournament? Because, we know we have a top 10 strength of schedule, which helps us. Our RPI is decent. Our ARC standing is decent as well. Our quad records are really good, especially quad 1. We probably have a decent chance of getting in. They're within the last 6 teams in the national tournament to be picked. They make the national tournament. They go to Rio Grande, first time. Now, obviously, take that with a grain of salt because that starting in 2021/2022 season, that was the first year that the NAIA, in terms of a national tournament, had 16 opening round host sites across the country. And this was the first year that the Lady Wildcats did not host at home in the opening round, which obviously was, a little bit of a shock. And then, of course, you look at what the team did. Of course, you play Cumberland's out of Kentucky in the opening round down at Rio Grande. Excellent Lady Patriots team. very well coached. You're able to upset them in overtime, and really in a game to where it was not looking good to win, especially early on. But you made enough shots down the stretch, played really good defense to where you're able to come out with a win, and then you play host Rio Grande after that, the number 2 seed in that pod, and the national tournament as far as that goes. And not just that, but number 8 in the country, averaging 95 points a game. You hold them to only 80, you score 86, monster upset. Emily Mattingly goes off for 29 points, a career high, despite playing on one healthy knee. And so, and then of course you win that game, you go out to Sioux City, and you lose in a heartbreaker to Dakota State, which ironically is a team that has knocked the Lady Wildcats out of a national tournament now 3 out of the last 4 years. Of course, 22-23, they knocked them out in the Elite 8 round, 23-24, knocked them out in the Sweet 16 round, and then 25-26 this past season, I should say, knocked them out once again in the Sweet 16 round. So, you look at that, and obviously it's not what you had wanted. However, this is the Lady Wildcats team that is looking so good for next year. You have Addie Hovey, you have Ayla Krieger, you have Ellie Kelleher, you have Emily Mattingly, of course, the big senior class with Mattingly, Kylie Bettinger, Tori Thompson, Bria Garber, Corinne Grivey. You have all of those key seniors next year that and again, I know there's several people that have said or that I've seen that have said that this is a Lady Wildcats team that could easily potentially go all the way next year, which I totally agree with that. And of course, I alluded to that, I believe, yesterday or the day before in my recap video during the national tournament, where I alluded to that more specifically, which I'm not going to dive into that in this video. But I will say that this is a Lady Wildcats team that it could, if they hit their full potential next year, I really think they could bring home a national championship. And obviously, and everybody had said that this year, whatever happened at the end of this year, was just a preview, so to speak, of what to expect next year. So obviously, the expectations next year are going to be go back out to Sioux City, and then whatever happens after that, it's just icing on the cake moving forward. So it's going to be interesting to see how all that plays out, that's for sure. So that is a view of my season recap video. Of course, I could talk about so many great players for the Wildcats this year. Ayla Krieger, star freshman, put up 507 points in her freshman season, just absolutely amazing. And she hasn't even hit her full potential yet. Averaged 15 points per game this year and shot over 45% from the field. Of course, Haley Amy, Saltmore shot the best a season, was the leading shooter on the team from the field at nearly 60%, and Ellie Kelleher was the leading three-point shooter on this team this year, shooting over 40% from beyond the arc, and was the leading free throw shooter as well on the team. Of course, after going over 4 in the Sweet 16 round against Dakota State, ended up being 78% at charity stripe on the year. So again, which is not too terribly bad. So, you look at her, you look at Addie Hovey, another star freshman, averaged, 11 points per game this year. And of course, I could just talk about so many other key players. Kylie Bettinger put up a career high 23 against Grace at home January 10th and shot a lot of three-pointers in that game. Of course, Emily Mattingly, career high against Rio Grande in that second-round upset of a national tournament, 29 points, shot 70% from the floor in that game. And on the year, she shot, I believe, only shot like 28% from 3, 73 at the free throw line this year. So again, these are some key players to really watch out for next year. That is for sure. Of course, you also have, so many other players on this team that I could talk about. Tori Thompson played excellent defense this year. Yeah, she might not have scored that many points in games. However, it was her defense that kept the team in. So, you look at just the amount of talent on this team. These are the key players that I really expect to have a standout year next year. So can't wait to watch all that unfold. Should be a lot of fun next year, that is for sure. So if you did enjoy this season recap video, officially ending season 2 of Matt Sports Talk, please either like, comment, or subscribe. Any one of those obviously helps me out greatly. I truly appreciate any feedback that you may provide me. And again, thank you so much for all your support, for your subscription for your subscribing rather to my channel. I really appreciate that. Please, let's hit 200 subscribers by the beginning of September, when I officially launch season 3 of Matt Sports Talk, and let's hit 500 subscribers by the end of next March. Those are 2 of my goals that I have for season 3. And again, I really hope my content has been super helpful and informative to you this year. And it was an honor and a huge blessing to be able to be a part of it. Can't wait to dive in and be back at it in the month of September with some very exciting things planned that you do not want to miss out on. Thanks so much for tuning into this video. Have a great rest of your day, a great week, a great spring and summer. God bless, and I can't wait to be back with you in September for Season 3 of Matt Sports Talk. God bless.